workday was winding down. Jason, a New York-based part-time taxi driver, was picking up fares through an app. His main job was with a small company in Brooklyn. But at night, he made a little extra cash behind the wheel. The entire day had been pretty quiet, and he was planning to call it a night when one last request came through from a passenger on Manhattan. It was already late, but night fares paid well, so Jason decided to take it. He pulled up to the address, and after a minute, he heard a quiet shuffling from the back seat as his passenger climbed in and carefully placed a large black suitcase next to him. The man looked pretty average, wrinkled suit, messy hair, like he'd just gotten out of a long meeting or a tough business trip. Jason gave him a nod in greeting but didn't get any response, so he pulled away from the curb. The passenger seemed off, staring out the window, occasionally glancing nervously at the suitcase. It seemed heavy from the way he dragged it into the car, insisting on bringing it into the back seat himself, rather than letting Jason stow it in the trunk. Jason drove in silence, but something about the man's behavior was making him uneasy. The guy would flinch every so often, like he'd just remember something terrible. Jason found himself instinctively avoiding eye contact through the rearview mirror. As they neared a quiet area on the edge of town, the passenger finally spoke, his voice low and almost a whisper. "Pull over here. Over here." It was strange, considering the address was on the other side of the city, but Jason decided not to ask questions and eased the car to the curb. The man pulled out his wallet, handed Jason a few bills, adding an extra one on top, but he stayed in the car. "Do you know what's over there?" the man asked, his gaze tense, his fingers trembling slightly. Jason looked at him, trying to make sense of the question. "Over where?" Jason replied, not sure what to expect. "There," the passenger gestured toward the road. "It's a quiet spot, old warehouses. Hardly anyone ever goes there. You understand?" Jason wasn't quite sure what the man meant, but he suddenly felt a surge of anxiety. The passenger reached toward his suitcase, and Jason felt the air in the car thicken, almost as if it were pressing down on him. "Would you?" The man hesitated, like he wanted to say something, but the words got caught in his throat. He looked out the window again, then turned back to Jason, suddenly intense. "I've got an important load here," he said, almost desperately. "If you don't help me, there's no one else who can." The man looked exhausted, and Jason felt a twinge of sympathy. But then he remembered the weight of that suitcase, what could possibly be inside. "That suitcase is heavy. Want me to put it in the trunk for you?" Jason tried to diffuse the tension a little. "No," the man snapped, clutching the suitcase as though he thought Jason might take it away. "It stays with me." Funny. Silence fell over the car again, and the tension only grew thicker. The man started to tremble slightly, and Jason, to his horror, realized he could smell something, a thick, metallic scent. It reminded him of something he didn't want to identify, but it was unmistakable. The man noticed Jason's reaction, but his hand stayed clamped tightly around the suitcase handle. After a few more minutes, the passenger seemed to make up his mind to finally say what he'd been holding back. "You're a driver, right? Can you take me a few more blocks, somewhere out of sight?" His voice was trembling, almost pleading. Jason didn't get a chance to answer before the passenger suddenly flung the door open and got out, leaving the suitcase in the car. He didn't even look back at it as he disappeared into the darkness, leaving Jason alone. The silence inside the car was deafening. The suitcase remained there, and something was definitely wrong with it. Jason couldn't just leave it behind and drive off, but he also couldn't shake his own curiosity. Almost on autopilot, his hands reached out, and he cautiously unzipped the suitcase. The smell that hit him was overwhelming. It was the stench of decay. Jason squeezed his eyes shut, trying to hold down his nausea, but curiosity won out, and he opened the suitcase all the way. Inside, wrapped in layers of canvas and plastic, was a human torso, headless, missing arms and legs. Jason slammed the suitcase shut, his heart pounding in his chest, his hands trembling. He had just uncovered something horrific. His first instinct was to reach for his phone to dial 911, but then he noticed the man standing in the shadows nearby, watching him. His eyes followed every move Jason made. The man's lips curled into a slight smile, sending chills down Jason's spine. Without a word, the man started walking back toward the car, and Jason, gripped by panic, realized he was trapped. If he didn't drive away now, he might never escape the situation. He slammed on the gas, leaving the man behind, abandoning the money, and drove off, barely able to breathe from the fear that had gripped him. Only when he reached a stoplight did he manage to dial 911. Thankfully, the police were nearby, and as soon as they heard his story, they headed to the spot where he'd left the suitcase. Later, the police told Jason that neither the man nor the suitcase were ever found. They did find faint traces of blood where Jason had opened the suitcase. No one ever saw the passenger again, but Jason knew his face would haunt his memory forever, like a nightmare he'd never be able to shake. Sam worked as a night shift taxi driver in Los Angeles. Like most drivers, he was used to strange passengers' drunk groups, people acting suspiciously, or others who avoided eye contact altogether. After a few years of night shifts, Sam thought he had seen it all. But one ride proved to be entirely different. It was around 3 in the morning, and Sam was ready to wrap up his shift. He was heading home on the freeway when he got a new request. The pickup was in a suburban area, and the passenger was asking to go downtown. Sam considered ignoring it. It was late, and he was tired. But the fare was high, so after a moment of hesitation, he decided to take it. As he navigated the mostly empty streets toward the pickup location, Sam noticed how remote and dark the area was. There were no streetlights, no nearby houses, just an empty road, leading to what looked like an abandoned part of town. Still, the app showed the address as legitimate. Finally, a figure appeared, walking toward him from the shadows. The man looked like he'd been through something. His jacket was worn, his hair unkempt, and his face, dimly lit by the headlights, looked exhausted and hardened, as if he had been traveling for days. Sam stopped and unlocked the back door. The man got in quickly, sighing with apparent relief as he settled into the seat. "Thanks for coming," he muttered, his voice low and shaky. "No problem." Whereto Sam replied with a polite smile. The man gave an address downtown, but then fell silent, staring down at his hands with an odd look. For the first few minutes, Sam tried to make small talk, but the passenger barely responded. He just stared out the window, occasionally glancing into the rearview mirror, as if he were watching for someone behind them. This made Sam uneasy, so he eventually gave up and drove on in silence. After a while, the man broke the silence with an unusual request. "Can you circle this area a few times?" he asked. Sam was surprised but agreed the fare was still running. After all, he drove in loops around the quiet, deserted neighborhood, feeling an increasing sense of dread. The man was unnaturally silent, his gaze distant, and he seemed more like a shell of a person than an actual presence. Eventually, Sam decided to check in. "Is everything all right? Do you need some help?" he asked carefully. The man looked at him, his face expressionless, but his eyes carrying a glint of fear. "I don't know," he replied, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror again. "I just need to make sure he's not following." Sam felt a chill. This was no longer just strange, it was downright unsettling. There was nobody in the rearview mirror, no other cars or people around. Trying to stay calm, he asked, "Who's he?" The man looked at Sam again, his eyes full of something like terror. "He's someone who always finds you. No matter where you go, he always shows up." Sam's heart began to race. The man's voice held an unmistakable sincerity, like he genuinely believed every word. It felt less like an explanation and more like a grim warning. They made another loop around the block. Then the man finally asked Sam to pull over. "Thank you. I'll get out here," he said, staring into the empty street. Before Sam could fully stop, the man opened the door and stepped out, disappearing into the darkness. Sam watched him walk away, a growing unease twisting in his stomach. The man seemed to vanish into the night, leaving Sam alone with his questions. He sighed and checked the app to close out the ride. But when he looked at the screen, his blood ran cold. The screen read "Passenger not found." Ride canceled. Confused and uneasy, Sam turned around to look at the back seat where the man had sat, but there was no trace of him, no signs anyone had been there at all. Rattled, he ended his shift and drove home, but he couldn't shake the memory of the man's words. The days that followed felt off, like the world had shifted in some way he couldn't explain. He started noticing strange cars following him and glimpsed shadows in his rearview mirror. Then, one night during his shift, he glanced in his mirror and saw the man's face staring back at him from the back seat. Heart pounding, Sam whipped around, but the seat was empty. The next day, another taxi driver found Sam's car abandoned in the same remote area where he had picked up that last passenger. Sam's body was slumped over the wheel, his eyes wide open with fear. No one could explain what had happened, but his last recorded ride was still open in the app, its destination left incomplete.